Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm Steve Call, the president of New America Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's conference and event about U.S. policy toward Cuba. I would like, first of all, to thank the man standing in the back with his arms folded, Patrick Doherty, who directs our Cuba Policy Initiative here, and his team. This is a subject that they've been working on for quite some time, long before it became as central to discourse about U.S. foreign policy as it is today. And I think we're all at New America exceptionally proud of the work that Patrick has done, developing this discourse, keeping it organized, creative, pressing the edge of what is acceptable in policy discourse, but also being purposefully inclusive in the way that he's gone about it. And I think you'll hear a lot of that today on the panel. You know, U.S.-Cuba policy has vexed more than a few administrations, and it now presents itself to the Obama administration in a similar way. It's a subject that has, in its grip on American foreign policy, far exceeded the weight of Cuba in international affairs, and it's often served as a symbolic proxy for other subjects. And I think that's a theme that we'll visit today more than once. This is a breaking point in U.S. thinking about foreign policy, with an administration that has come in willing to put a lot of difficult subjects on the table in a new way. And perhaps U.S. policy toward Cuba in 4 or 8 years will, in fact, look quite different than it did last autumn. But I think, as is obvious from today's news, that is far from certain at this hour. The executive orders that the president issued yesterday are certainly an important break with the policy that he inherited, but they're also incremental in some ways, and I think it's unusual to think about episodes in U.S. foreign policy of this character where you're attempting to break down barriers or open a path to engagement, where the first change in policy that's been frozen in place for such a long time involves a subset of the American population. I can't think of another episode in American history where a particular group of exiles or immigrants or Americans has been the instrument of an opening of this kind. So perhaps there are other examples, and I'm sure Mike Lind will think them through, but it's certainly in the modern period a striking example of something that is not typical of the way Americans think about their own immigrant population and its relationship to foreign policy. So the New America Foundation is certainly working very hard to think about all of these challenges and to make a case that a revised U.S.-Cuba relationship could represent an opportunity for the United States, but also to be inclusive in the discourse that surrounds that proposition, and to think it through at a pragmatic level more than anything else. And the colleague at New America who's been working with Patrick very hard on this will lead us through the panel and introduce the panel, and remind you also of the fact that we're on C-SPAN today. We're broadcasting this live on the web at New America, so when it comes time for you to participate, please remember you're on the record. Please remember to wait for the microphone, and please remember to turn off your beeping electronic devices. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Steve Clemens, the director of the American Strategy Program here at New America.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, Steve. I also want to second Steve's thanks of Patrick, Ben Katcher, and other members of our team. But what we've been doing in U.S.-Cuba relations has been working with a broad coalition of people. Many of them are in this room. But I want to say one quick word to our good friend Sarah Stevens of the Center for Democracy in the Americas, who's been a real trooper in this for a long time. She's put out for all of you 9 ways for U.S. to talk to Cuba and for Cuba to talk to us. And I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to take a look at this important work. I also think that my friend Peter Kornblue is in the audience from the National Security Archives Project at George Washington University. The magazine is called Cigar Aficionado. Is it Cigar Aficionado or is it just Aficionado? But the place was the cigar smoke. But there are a lot of great Cuba-related articles in this. But one of the most interesting that he's recently run, which I commend to everyone, is a story of how many American presidents have, behind the scenes, with not a lot of public purview and with classified documents, been dancing with Cuba and Cuban leadership for a long time, and on the edge in many occasions, in the Nixon administration, even with Ronald Reagan, with others, and Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton. I think all with the exception probably of George H.W. Bush, every president has essentially come close to making a major pivot point in this relationship. Now we've seen, as of yesterday, Barack Obama has lifted remittance and travel restrictions on Cuban Americans. I wrote somewhat facetiously and in a friendly way that we need to keep tilting forward because those people of Iceland who've become U.S. citizens are still not part of the package, nor Japanese Americans, nor African Americans not from Cuba, etc. And that you know, as I told someone, of having been long time ago, I think sort of like David Rothkopf, whom I'm going to say a word about in a moment, we used to all pay attention to Russia, the Soviet Union, and how the Soviet system or the Chinese communist system used to organize. And in my view, it is a characteristic of totalitarian regimes to restrict the travel of its people, not of democratic regimes. And this is Congressman Jeff Flake, who helped launch our US-Cuba initiative 2 years ago, made that statement that it is strange that our government is still in the business of restricting travel. Let me say a few words about our panel here today, each of which is going to offer a slice of reaction and thought, both about the Summit of the Americas, which is coming on in some cases, and then also where US-Cuba relations fits in to the 21st century national security portfolio of the United States. First to my right, Carl Meacham. Carl is the senior policy advisor for Latin America to Senator Richard Lugar on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was in the news quite a bit recently for being an author with Senator Lugar of an important, what they call committee print, which is available now publicly, looking at U.S.-Cuba relations, and has been one of the primary architects, along with the senator, of some pretty profound thinking, I believe, in terms of guidance and advice to the administration. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, long-term aide to former General Colin Powell, General Colin Powell, and former Chief of Staff at the U.S. State Department. And Larry chairs our U.S.-Cuba Policy Initiative here at the New America Foundation. He's also the Pamela Harriman Visiting Professor at the College of William and Mary. Michael Lind has many hats at New America Foundation, but today he's a White House Senior Fellow, but he's very active as a director of our Public Infrastructure Project and our Economic Growth Program. But Mike, who's the author of The American Way of Strategy, is one of the country's leading thinkers in thinking about America's strategy. And one of the themes that underlies our interest in today's program is, what would an interest-led strategy from the United States towards this region and Cuba really look like? And I'm looking forward to Mike's views on that. Julia Sweig, in a friendly way, I call the sort of grand diva of Latin America stuff at the Council on Foreign Relations. She is, I'm supposed to introduce her new book, which I will come back to later. Patrick, you're going to get me the picture of Julia's book, which is about to come out. I think she receives the galley this week. But Julia is also regularly featured in Cigar Aficionado, which I'll leave that to her. But she has also been very involved with the CFR in helping a broad-based bipartisan group to look at how the United States might look at Latin America very differently than it has been. And I think, without putting words into Julia's mouth, I think she would say that our interaction, our prioritization, and our general template for interacting with Latin America has largely been a failure in recent years. And she's been trying to bring together, leading the great and the good, generals, people from the public policy community, the think tank arena, trade associations, and others, to sort of look at how you would redesign that relationship, not just with Cuba, but with the region. David Rothkopf is a very, very cool guy. He is a blogger at Foreign Policy Magazine. He is a writer of some of the most insider-esque books, best-selling books on the National Security Council. It's decision-making, most recently, of the book Running the World. He is the chairman and CEO, the president and CEO of Rothkopf Garten. And he is a real entrepreneur in a whole variety of areas. But I particularly enjoy most, David, the blogging role that you've now taken up. And he's sort of getting used to it. But we're linking to each other. It's sort of an interesting kind of dance. Tomabs Omestad, who was the long-term associate editor of Foreign Policy magazine, is now diplomatic correspondent for U.S. News and World Report. He's been very active, visited Cuba, has been writing and thinking about Cuba recently and in the media quite a bit on his own views on Cuba, so it's great to have him. Bill Reinsch, an old friend from many years ago when he was the Undersecretary of Commerce for the Bureau of Export Administration, is one of our leading folks in town who knows everything about trade and setting that agenda in the portfolio of interest for the country, and he is now president of the National Foreign Trade Council. And his staff member, I want to just point out, Jake Colvin, has just an outstanding job of helping to bring the agriculture and the business sector into this question in a less myopic and narrow way, frankly, than the business sector used to be involved. We're all, to some degree, self-interested, but it's nicer when you see those interests broaden, and I think I want to commend NFTC's work for trying to create that broadening of interest with regard to Latin America trade in general, but Cuba specifically. So let me start. I'm going to go not in order here, but I know some people have some time sensitivities, but let me invite Lawrence Wilkerson to go first, and then we'll work through, and then Carl. So Larry, and you're welcome to join me at the podium or to sit, but I think cameras would love you at the podium more. Why don't you come here? It was a fake choice.
What's the time like?
5, 6 minutes.
5 or 6 minutes? Oh, that's easy. Colin Powell once told me, speaking really of the Eastern Caribbean, but I think it's very applicable to the entire Caribbean, and for that matter to Latin America in general, that if one wants to know what's going on, consult the mighty sparrow. Or, in other words, calypso, steel drum tunes, or as Abdel Prieto, the culture minister of Cuba, would probably say, art in general. Or as Shakespeare would say, consult the mirror to life. The mighty sparrow pronounced on Barack Obama rather eloquently. Barack the Magnificent is the name of the steel drum tune. The last time a major statement was made on an American president in calypso was Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a result of the good neighbor policy. And the lyrics of that calypso tune, which are quite prolific, are an interesting thing to read today. Because what you understand is that it's been almost half a century plus that anybody in Latin America cared to comment on El Coloso del Norte, the Yankees, the gringos, because our policy has been so bad in our own hemisphere, in our own backyard. And it doesn't matter whether you go to Ottawa or Buenos Aires, the message is the same. And now the mighty sparrow is saying, Barack the Magnificent. And if you read the lyrics to that rather short tune, you understand the profound expectations that Latin America has for El Presidente, our president, Barack Obama. Those expectations were not probably whetted very much by the announcement yesterday. I'm sure they're still being vetted. I'm sure they're still being looked at closely from Havana to wherever in Latin America, but I don't think they really are going to excite that many people. And so I hope we are prepared to go, and I hope this is a tactical move, a whole lot further. If you want to know why, in my view, this is so difficult, you have to grasp the kind of writing that Lars Schultz, for example, at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, has just turned out in a book very appropriately called That Infernal Little Republic, Cuba. That, of course, comes from TR, when TR was in one of his best moments, if you will, commenting on that little island of 11 million souls, not so many then, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And we forget the latter part of that where he says, I'd like to wipe every one of them out. And before we understand that going all the way back to Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison, and others who coveted that island, indeed who thought it would be, after Florida, a state, how this relationship is tortured. It's tortured by our arrogance, by our hubris, by our overweening power, And it's tortured by the fact that the island, in the face of that, has extended the middle finger to us through 10 presidents and not been rebuffed, indeed not been dealt with at all, except in a way that isolates increasingly us and not them. So you can see my angst over the infinitesimal movement that occurred yesterday, and my hope that the mighty sparrow is righter than I am, and that his expectations, and the expectations, I think, of almost every soul in Latin America, will be met, and be met more swiftly perhaps than our almost dysfunctional foreign policy process would allow when domestic interests are so dominant in it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Larry. Carl Meacham.
Well, I'm going to try to be as artful as the Colonel was, but I don't think I can be. I'm just going to make a couple of brief remarks just to, note how important the event yesterday, the announcement was yesterday. This is a big change. This is a change in direction from what we've seen in the last 8 years for sure, and longer than that. Most of the folks here probably remember the history of this issue a lot better than I do. I'm a newcomer to this issue, but I think that, as most folks know, in Washington everything is timing. And I think that the senator made a very good call earlier this year when, in the beginning of the report that I wrote on this issue, spoke some truths with regards to our policy to Cuba. In a way, he let the cat out of the bag, at least in this round of the discussion on Cuba, and I think that we've seen some of those results yesterday. I think that the reaction, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on the international side of things. Most of the folks here know the domestic side, and I think that it's important that those folks talk about that issue and the domestic sources of this discussion. But I think that what's important here as well is to talk about the reaction that the region will have in the run-up to the summit on the 17th. I think that it will be positive. I think that folks will see it as a gesture, even though Spokesman Gibbs yesterday said that it was keeping with the campaign promise of the president, which I think he is doing as well. But I think that the implications go far beyond a campaign promise. I think that it's a very important development. So hopefully folks in the region, when they follow this issue and when the president goes to Trinidad and Tobago, will be more willing to listen to our president, be more willing to work with the United States than we have seen in the recent past. And I think a lot of this is an opportunity to turn the page on how we've approached the region and the focus on some of these unilateral gestures, but also in keeping with what the president has said, this gives an opportunity for dialogue. I mean, the president just didn't talk about the fact that we needed to make reforms on remittances and travel. He also said that we need to have dialogue, and hopefully this is the first step in that direction. So I'd focus on that. Hopefully that dialogue will lead to more conversations on issues like human rights. Let's not forget that there are serious challenges on the island with regards to human rights and the participation of regular Cubans in their society and their democracy. So I think that as long as we can look at this gesture and approach this with our eyes wide open with regards to the challenges that we do face with regards to Cuba and how Cubans live, I think that we're going to be doing the right thing. The right approach is to continue as we have. The right approach is to continue focusing on the dialogue, focusing on what we can do from our side, not letting Havana dictate what we decide to do, letting the United States, letting Washington decide what's in our interests. So I just want to put that out for you, and I look forward to some of the Q&A. Thank you.
Carl, thank you very much. And thank you for the work you're doing with Senator, who I love in the reports always starts out with an American national interest sort of preamble into a lot of work. Let me invite Julia Sweig next.
Thanks very much for having me, Steve and Patrick and everybody here at New America, and thanks to all of you coming. The order of battle this morning is only in your mind, so I will try to share my remarks with you, not only on this announcement of yesterday from the White House, but also sort of some broader thoughts on the region. It's true, as Carl said, that this is refreshing by comparison to the last 8 years. I'm making reference there to the announcement for Cuban Americans to be able to travel and send remittances to their family members. But as a Lithuanian, Polish, Jewish American, I guess I just wish that one doesn't require a hyphen in order to be able to benefit from that right. And I do want to just remind, especially those of you that are here from the press, that Cuba is the only country that most Americans are still banned by their own government from traveling to. And the creation of one class of Americans, giving them one right by comparison to all of the rest of us, seems to me to be highly, sort of an extraordinary kind of American exceptionalism that's virtually un-American. And I'm hoping that will change soon, whether because of the Congress, Senator Lugar and Senator Dodd and Senators Dorgan and the members of the House of Representatives that are advancing legislation to eliminate the travel embargo, period, and that the White House will certainly get out of the way of that process, which it seems to be doing, and that's great news. Now, why is it that so that is a preamble? Why is it that Latin America is insisting over the last several months with the Obama administration that Cuba be the litmus test and that American policy toward Cuba be the litmus test for whether, in fact, the Obama administration represents change more broadly to the hemisphere? 50 years after the United States itself made Latin America policy toward Cuba the litmus test for hemispheric relations, the Latin Americans, in unison, now including Costa Rica and soon the newly elected government of El Salvador, will be in unison, have open diplomatic ties or about to open diplomatic ties with Cuba, and have made Cuba the litmus test for judging Washington's policy toward Latin America, which is almost hard to understand if one looks at all of the enormous problems and challenges on the ground in the region. The global financial crisis, the recession at home in the United States are exacting excruciating challenges for Latin America, which is facing the potential of as many as 15 million people to go back into poverty. One could say that the problems of organized crime in Mexico and Central America, as far as Brazil, related to illegal drug trafficking and other sort of criminal networks, are far more serious to Latin Americans than what Washington decides to do about untangling its 50-year failed policy toward Cuba. And yet what we have, and every day in every way since Obama came to office and before, even beginning with George Bush, is this drumbeat that Washington must change its policy toward Cuba. Why is that? 3 reasons, and there are more, and we can, I'm sure the others on the panel will add to this. Obviously, the symbolism of Cuba, the failure of U.S. policy toward Cuba, the Cubanization of U.S. policy toward Latin America for the last 50 years has now, in a much more democratic context, in a place where Cuba has many, many friends at the highest level of government, in governments left, right, and center, and throughout societies in Latin America, the symbol of Washington's policy towards Cuba is irresistible as a rallying cry and as a barometer of possible change. The substance of U.S. policies toward Cuba, of course, is offensive and highly contradictory toward the intrinsically toward it with respect to America's own policies in Latin America. This is a country that has promoted free trade, yet we have a trade embargo. This is a country that has had in the last several years a very aggressive war on terrorism, yet we harbor Cuban terrorists here in the United States. The list could go on and on. So the substance of U.S. policy is also offensive. And finally, on this matter of strategy, I think that there is a sense especially, well, throughout Latin America, but especially the larger, most active regional powers such as Brazil, that outstretching a hand to Washington to help Washington put aside its conflict with Cuba can be helpful on a strategic sense in diffusing the polarization in the Andean region and potentially in South Central America, two parts of the Americas in which it has become pretty popular to make hay out of picking fights with Washington, and Washington's beef with Cuba, of course, is a big centerpiece of those countries in the Andes and in Central America that may want to continue some serious enmity with Washington. Taking the Cuba issue off the table will help, and I think Latin Americans see this as essential as a way for Washington actually to build more cooperative ties in Central America, in the Andes, specifically on organized crime, on poverty reduction, on energy cooperation, on the real issues that this White House surely is going to bring to the Summit of the Americas. So getting Cuba out of the way will help in a real strategic sense. And finally, the last thing I want to say is that domestic politics here in the United States are always, and it seems even more so, shaping our policy toward Latin America, and not just on Cuba. We have this with respect to drug policy, energy policy, trade, immigration, but oddly enough, despite what we saw in terms of what the White House seems to take away from the 2008 election in Florida, I believe that domestic politics on the Cuba front may be, of all of those issues, the easiest to crack open. And so I would hope that what we're going to see as the Congress moves forward and the White House does approach a process without calling it a process, perhaps, that we will see that the domestic politics, at least on this issue, do begin to diffuse. And I have a last point after my last point, which is that the issue of human rights and democracy and dialogue around those issues is possible with Cuba, is already taking place between Cuba and the European Union member countries and the European Union as a whole, as well as between Cuba and Latin America. So I think the Obama administration may well find that as it goes forward, it even can talk about human rights and democracy and bringing more pluralism and a more open society to Cuba as it and the Congress and the American society as a whole begin to unpack and diffuse these 50 years of tension. So thanks very much for your attention.
Julia. Perfect. Let me invite William Reinsch to join us. And there is logic in this order.
I'll trust you to reveal it at some
You pointed out
appropriate moment. Thanks for the opportunity to join all of you. The National Foreign Trade Council runs USA Engage, which is an organization that's dedicated to opposing unilateral economic sanctions, which is why I'm happy to be part of this and welcome the things that the President did yesterday. We've always believed that unilateral sanctions are a bad policy in almost every situation. They don't achieve our diplomatic and foreign policy objectives for the most part because they are unilateral. They hurt American business by cutting off market share and sales opportunities in favor of their competition. And to the extent that we try to enforce our unilateral sanctions extraterritorially, we end up irritating our friends and allies. Cuba is a textbook case, I think, of the failure of that unilateral sanctions policy for exactly the reasons I just described. We've been working on the embargo now for nearly 50 years, and guess what? He's still there, and the government is still there. Ironically, we think that the biggest beneficiary of the embargo probably has been Castro, because it makes it easy for him to demonize the United States, and it makes it easy for his government to blame its failures on the embargo. And one of the things that we've noticed, and one of the things I kind of expect in the next few days, is that when the United States takes an opening gesture, which, as those of you that follow this know, has happened from time to time. It happened in the Carter administration, happened at one point in the Clinton administration. There is, more often than not, a negative Cuban response that then serves to polarize the situation further. So it's going to be interesting to wait and see. The next shoe is going to come from down there, not from here. But it'll be interesting to see whether the Cuban government accepts the opening gestures that have been made in good faith and tries to start the dialogue that it says it wants, or whether it responds in some way that will attempt to further polarize a situation which has already been political and polarized for a long time. Our preference would be a strategy of engagement, and that's why we think what happened yesterday, albeit modest in immediate scope, is very important, because particularly after the last 8 years, because it opens some doors and it creates some opportunities to move forward. I think it's important for the people I represent, U.S. business. There's a lot of economic reports, most of them by the ITC, that estimates the Cuba embargo costs the U.S. economy between $1 and $1.5 billion annually, and costs us, give or take, 20,000 jobs. There's a 2007 ITC report that suggests that without travel restrictions, up to 1 million U.S. citizens would travel to Cuba annually, which would have a lot of benefit from an engagement standpoint. That kind of contact is win-win. We gain from learning from and interacting with the Cuban people, and they gain vice versa the same way. Their tourist industry also gains, and on a practical level, the removal of restrictions on remittances yesterday will, I think, prove to be very helpful to the Cuban economy. So it's a win for business, it's a win for people. I think it's also a win for American policy, American foreign policy, and here some of the other speakers have already commented on that. I think it signals change. I think particularly to our friends and allies in Latin America, the move signals what I hope will be a new approach that will allow them to refocus their energy on a dialogue with us that's more comprehensive and is not infected, if you will, by this single issue that keeps on sitting out there. Now that, of course, depends a little bit on what the Cubans do, and it depends on whether our government sees this as an initial step that they can follow up on with additional steps. While we have long simply advocated the end of the embargo, that's probably not, at least legislatively, realistic in the short run. But there clearly are some other steps that one could take to continue the trend that began yesterday. Julia mentioned, I think, in a way, one of the most important ones, and that is to remove the impediments to travel for everybody, and not just for Cuban Americans, which I think makes a lot of sense, not only on the grounds that she described, but on sort of practical engagement grounds, which I think would produce win-win benefits for all of us. We would like to see also some further easing of restrictions on trade and banking. The government could do a better job of, after this peculiar episode in the omnibus appropriation, of unraveling the payment in advance restrictions that have been imposed by the last administration on Cuba. They could also, I think, usefully in the short run ease the embargo by opening up exports of things beyond agriculture and humanitarian goods, including things like agricultural machinery and heavy equipment, both of which would provide the goods and technology needed to help Cuba respond more effectively to the humanitarian crisis it's experiencing through last year's storms, which then there'll be this year's storms. That's where they are. We could also work, and this will require congressional action too, but I think we should spend more time working to eliminate the extraterritorial provisions of Helms-Burton and other related to Cuban sanctions to minimize the threat of blocking statutes and international diplomatic and legal challenges. This has been a serious problem in the past several years. So those of you that follow this closely remember it runs from these bizarre incidents of hotels kicking out, Cubans and then being sued in various places. And this is just sort of an unnecessary sideshow to the whole thing. It makes us look stupid. We are trying to enforce laws that don't work in third countries. Norway was an example. Mexico was another one. Where we have no business trying to do this kind of thing. We irritate friends in other governments. We don't achieve our objectives, and we look silly in the process. So there's a lot of things we can do, all of which I hope will lead to, and this is my final point, eventually, hopefully soon, some engagement in diplomacy with the Cuban government. In a way, the beauty of yesterday's step is that for the first time in a number of years, it puts the burden on the other side. It says to the Cubans, we are prepared to, we've made an important gesture here, we are prepared to initiate a dialogue. We are prepared to initiate communications, which is, I think, fundamental to yesterday's announcement. Now it's your turn to decide if you want to reciprocate. You've said many times that you want to have that dialogue, and now I think President Obama is saying, we look forward to that. And I think that's a very welcome step, and I hope that you know, in a few months we can come back and have another one of these and be talking about the next step that's been taken. Thank you.
You have a deal, Bill. Let me ask my colleague Michael Lind to join us.
Thank you, Steve. Let me begin by taking up Steve Cole's challenge to find historical parallels. I think there's a tendency to blame the US-Cuba relationship entirely on the machinations of Cuban expatriates. I think it's very misleading. The two historical parallels are the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. What links the three is communism, Marxist-Leninism, this great ideological struggle that convulsed the world and polarized the United States in the 20th century. It wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt that the United States finally recognized the government of the Soviet Union, and it wasn't until Richard Nixon that the U.S. had diplomatic relations with China. So I think you have to view Castro's Cuba as the third in this series of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, which simply brings out how anachronistic our policy is, given the fact that we do have relations now with Vietnam, with the PRC, and with other communist countries following the Cold War. Let me address another theme of today's panel, which is whether the U.S. has a Latin American policy in general, and if so, what should it be? And I'm going to be somewhat skeptical. I think through most of American history, the U.S. has not thought of Latin America or the hemisphere as an integrated entity with which it has some sort of comprehensive policy. On the contrary, the U.S. has, from the time of the early republic to the present, has tended to divide this hemisphere into the North American quarter sphere, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, and South America, which for all practical purposes most of the time, you know, could be Australia. There's the famous, perhaps apocryphal quote from Henry Kissinger, South America is a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. And I think we see a radical difference in American approaches to these different geographic regions. The North American quarter sphere tends to be treated as an extension of the American border. In other words, it's not traditional arm's length interstate foreign relations, but it's largely treated as a source of threats, immigrants, imports, drugs, narcotics. And it's deeply embroiled in domestic politics. By contrast, when the United States pays attention to South America, it tends to be in the context of a larger geopolitical struggle with some extra-hemispheric power, whether it was the Germans in World War I and World War II or the Soviets the rest of the time. So South America tends to be, I don't want to use the term a pawn, but its significance is viewed in the context of United States relations with Europe or perhaps with Asia. Actually, there was a great scare around the turn of the century about Japanese influence in Latin America, both Mexico and South America. Well, do we see prospects for this changing? I would certainly hope so. I think you could get a commission of the great and the good could come up with a hemispheric policy or even a North American policy. Everything from common infrastructure and energy to common migration policies, human rights, international police cooperation, but have the factors that historically given us two Latin American policies, one towards the near abroad to the immediate south of the United States and one towards South America, changed. I'm not sure they have. And you know, for that reason, I'm reminded of a story from rabbinical Jewish literature. The old story is, and this represents the disillusionment of Jews with claims of the Messiah. The story goes, if you're chopping wood and someone tells you the Messiah has come, keep chopping wood. So somewhat in that spirit, I think if you're doing something and someone tells you that a new era in U.S.-Latin American relations has dawned, don't necessarily drop what you're doing. Thanks.
Mike, thank you very much. Next, Tom Omestad.
Thank you, Steve. Well, with this sort of panel, I thought it might be most useful to talk a little bit about my recent experience down in Havana and elsewhere on the island. I was down there for about 10 days, and I thought, while I had the requisite meetings with a variety of officials in Havana, I thought it was perhaps most interesting to get a sense of the temperature in the streets of Havana with respect to the new Obama era. And not surprisingly, what I found is that there's tremendous enthusiasm among many ordinary Cubans about what President Obama represents, both as a personal story and as a possible answer to their prayers. I think, regrettably, the way the sweep of history normally works, they will undoubtedly be disappointed to some degree. Nonetheless, it was a very pleasant time to be in Havana because it's, I find, as I do parachute journalism around the world, it's always a pleasure to visit a place where the mood is on the uplift at the moment, when there's when unrealistic expectations are taking hold. It tends to make my job a bit easier. There is no shortage of cynicism and skepticism among ordinary Cubans about how relations might evolve with the United States. However, I was startled at just how positive so many people were about Obama. For example, I had one fellow, I'll give you a couple of anecdotes, who, unprompted by me, came up and said, look, let's do a trade. You take Raul Castro and we'll take Barack Obama. And I think that set the tone. By the way, I would add one other observation. This whole subject of U.S.-Cuban relations is an unexpectedly delightful subject that draws on the resourceful Cuban sense of humor, which is, I'm happy to say, far from extinguished. More than one, actually, a couple of Cubans came up to me and said, unprompted by me, you know, we voted for Barack Obama too. So I think I would venture to say that as you travel the world and we hear about this incredible reaction to Obama in so many foreign capitals, that in Havana is absolutely no exception, and in fact probably on the upper side of the spectrum in those terms. Not surprisingly, many Cubans are a bit vague about what they really expect from Obama. When you ask them, these of course are not policy people, they think that somehow the easing of tensions will lead to a more prosperous, more peaceful, and a more normal life. I think there's a great craving for normalcy, and frankly, after so many years of living under that system, there is something of a pragmatic focus on improving their daily economic lives. I think that takes priority from many people at the moment. In terms of officials, predictably, the sense of the Obama era is somewhat different. There's a good deal of cynicism, a bit jaded, I might say, and certainly a feeling of, well, we've been there, done that. After all, the Castros now are experiencing their 11th American president. So there is a reserve of cynicism and skepticism about dealing with even the best-intentioned new U.S. administrations. I think they made three central points that are germane and particularly relevant given the policy announcement that we all heard yesterday. First of all, they naturally, given the campaign rhetoric of President Obama, anticipated the removal of restrictions on Cuban-American travel and remittances. A very clear message across the spectrum of officials down there was that we welcome it. We do perceive it as a humanitarian, family-oriented gesture, but it's not enough. It's essentially, in their view, undoing a series of policy mistakes made here in Washington, particularly in their view during the Bush administration. And so while it's welcomed, it doesn't amount to much. We welcome it, though. The second basic point they made is that they, and this is certainly traditional Cuban government policy, they accept no preconditions on any political dialogue that might evolve during the Obama years. So I think that is a stipulation that deserves a lot of attention today and onward, simply because the president's policy announcement yesterday, while dancing over it, I think, in lacking specificity, certainly was framed in terms of the traditional Washington interest in framing Cuba policy in terms of democracy promotion and freedom and human rights. All very laudable goals, but the Cuban government's position on fashioning that in some respects as a precondition for starting, let alone making serious progress on a political dialogue, could well be a non-starter, and that's exactly the term that was used on a number of occasions, including from the Foreign Ministry. Third, a very clear argument on their part that the basic movement has to start with Washington. That said, if they perceive a significant move or set of moves from Washington, they're willing to move gesture for gesture, and those, of course, are words that have been adopted by Raul Castro, the president of Cuba. So I think overall, while we're waiting for the official reaction from Cuba, it's useful to ponder a little bit of the sort of societal expectation down in Cuba and what the officials there have been saying. I suspect that they will, in the coming days, react with a cautious welcome on the moves with respect to Cuban Americans. I would not be surprised if there is a good deal of unhappiness, perhaps even bristling, at the tone with which the new policy was announced yesterday. Fairly or unfairly, I think they will see that as a continuation of the fundamental policy instinct that has taken root in Washington for decades. And in terms of the moves on telecommunications, I simply don't know. I think there'll be a certain amount of skepticism on the part of the Cuban government on that as well, but perhaps that's food for thought and could be, in fact, the source of a technical dialogue that could unfold in the coming weeks and months. A couple of other brief points, not only from officials, but from a variety of Cubans down there. Despite the decades of deprivation and the unhappiness, I think that there is very little detectable sense of desperation on the part of the Cuban government and those close to the Cuban government in terms of trying to forge a better relationship with the United States. The very strong analytical consensus down there is that the international community is moving in their directions. They feel as though relations with a variety of Latin American countries have improved better than ever. And they also feel as though they've developed a much better relationship with Russia, recouping that a bit. China, they've restarted a dialogue with the European Union. So I think that they're feeling, at least in terms of diplomatic standing, on the upswing. And while amenable to beginning a dialogue with the United States, feeling under no particular pressure. Interestingly, and very hard to fathom for a visiting journalist or let alone a longtime analyst of Cuba, is the degree to which there'll be pressure in the society to try to meet Barack Obama halfway, get something going, seize on this as an opportunity. I can't really shed much light on that. I would just simply raise it as a question. I think that Raul Castro has certainly shown signs of being more attentive to the views of the Cuban public and wanting to at least manage expectations, manage his public opinions in a way that was not true under his brother. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And there's a reason why I wanted to leave David Rothkopf to last, and there was an order, logic to this order today, and I want to, there are many people watching this live today, not only on C-SPAN, but on the WashingtonNote.com, the HavanaNote.com, and on New America Foundation's websites as well. And there are other resources out there and other great programs that have been done. And one of them was done the other day at the Council on Foreign Relations by Julia Sweig. And now I have the cover of her new book, which will be out shortly, called Cuba, What Everyone Needs to Know. Julia Sweig. This is the first time this has been shown anywhere in public, this graphic. And it will soon be available for purchase at Amazon and, you know, your favorite New America Foundation bookstore. But Julia chaired a magnificent session the other day that featured the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, Ambassador Jeffrey Davido, our former ambassador to Mexico, who is the point person for the Obama administration in organizing the Summit of the Americas, and David Rothkopf. And there was an exchange between them that was frankly extraordinary. I wrote about it on my blog quoting David, and I recommend that folks go listen to the audio or look at the transcript on the CFR website. But in that, David said he said so many memorable things, but the two that really stood out were one, that it is remarkable that today it is easier for an American to go to visit, and to do business with a Stalinist nuclear weapon-toting country like North Korea than to go to Cuba. And he then went on and offended all the Edsel owner associations in America, because I heard from them, calling US-Cuba relations the Edsel of American foreign policy. And I put this sort of dilapidated Edsel on the blog. And even my Cuban friends in Cuba, one of them emailed me to said, stop insulting Edsels. So with that, let me invite David Rothkopf to the podium.
Thanks very much. This is Julia's book cover.
Okay.
And it will be out soon. And she'll be back here. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate the invitation, and I hope that this is a continuation of the leadership role that the New America Foundation has long played, in that perhaps this will be the beginning of the farewell tour of Cuba seminars in Washington. It's long overdue. And, you know, with all due respect to all of you who have come and to anybody who's watching this, it is a bit ridiculous, right? It's a bit ridiculous that we're in a world in which there is a global economic downturn that is hurling hundreds of millions of people into poverty, that will result in 50 million people losing their jobs this year, in which we have a war in Iraq, a war in Afghanistan, which happens really to be in Pakistan, a complete rearrangement of the global financial order, the global geopolitical order that we've dealt with over time, where global warming may, you know, make the planet uninhabitable, and we're discussing a tiny island with 11 million people that has the strategic significance to the United States of Curacao. Okay, nothing against Curacao, but this is not the kind of thing that we ought to be discussing right now, and it drives home a really important point, which is really bad policies are not just bad because they don't work, although this one certainly hasn't worked. Really bad policies are bad because of their opportunity cost. They suck the oxygen out of the room. We spent the past 8 years fighting a global war on terror, and we didn't, you know, address real issues. We worried about the threats to Wall Street and not the threats from Wall Street, and now we're paying for that in a serious way. And, you know, to put this whole thing in perspective, I'll take my friend Bill's number of losing $1.5 billion a year. That means that bad Cuba policy over half a century, if we had lost that much every year, has lost less money for us than bad AIG policy. Okay, so that sort of puts this into some kind of perspective. Look at the hemisphere. Not only do we have a serious security problem in Mexico that is spilling over our borders and requires real attention, but we have vast changes throughout the region. Do you know what the most active financial institution in Latin America in the past couple of months is? The China Development Bank. The Chinese government has lent tens of billions of dollars in Latin America over the past 6 months, buying up access to natural resources. Now, I don't, by the way, view this as a deep threat to the United States. I view this as a sign that other countries have real policies towards the region that address the real issues in the region, and we're sitting here discussing a policy pertaining to a country whose only distinction at this point is how bad our policy is toward it. You know, and by the way, if you are looking for a solution to this policy, or if you're looking to figure out how this is going to play out, keep that fact in mind. If you are waiting for Fidel and Raul to respond to this opening, why would they? Their only distinction is having the policy. They'll just wait it out. Why should they do anything to open to the United States? If they open, they stop being special, and the country becomes another Caribbean destination, which, you know, is, you know, I hope that that happens sometime soon. But the reality is this. The Cuba policy is bad because it doesn't work, and it hasn't worked for 50 years. And that old definition of insanity, of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, plays here. I think the foreign policy definition of insanity, by the way, was referred to earlier by Bill, which is unilateral sanctions. They don't work. We know that. The policy is completely inconsistent with every policy that we have towards other countries that give us a problem in the world, whether it was North Korea, as Steve mentioned, or the depth of our integration with the Saudi government, which has a pretty lousy human rights record, or the depth of our support for an Afghanistani government, which just legalized rape within marriage and made it illegal for women to go outside the house without the permission of their husbands. That's a government we support, okay? So, you know, to say, well, we can't have this policy change with Cuba is an absurdity. And to treat this issue with the deferential respect and the mountains of papers that are being written about it doesn't help anybody. It treats what is broken and indefensible as though it were a policy deserving of this kind of incremental debate. It should be over. Okay, you know, what the Obama administration, is this the beginning of the end? Okay, let's hope it's the beginning of the end. Fidel Castro, that unbiased observer, responded apparently this morning saying it was, you know, too little, too late. Well, this may be the only time it's ever happened, but I have to agree with him. Too little, too late. Let's move on. Let's get to real policies. The summit of the America next week shouldn't be dealt with, it shouldn't be focused on this. The Inter-American Development Bank released a study at their annual meeting in Medellin, which suggested that if the current path of the downturn in the region is followed, 50 million people in the region will be pushed back into absolute poverty. That's 5 Cubas. And we're discussing this, and we're not having a serious discussion about whether the United States should replenish the Inter-American Development Bank, provide new capital for growth in the region, address the growth issues in the region. And by the way, it's not just a humanitarian impulse, although that ought to drive us to some extent, particularly in the quarter sphere, which Michael referred to earlier. When there is economic downturn, we have immigration problems, crime problems, security problems, border problems. It is self-interested of the United States to engage on the big issues of the region, just like it is self-interested of the United States to disengage from this absurd anachronism and to take it and to move it to exactly where it belongs, next to the Fonzie's jacket in the Smithsonian Institute, as an example of bad American foreign policy of the late 20th century. Thank you very much.
Now I'm going to hear from all these people who are Fonzie fans. I want to, before we open the floor, just say a couple of things. One, we are quite honored and pleased to report that while you were all sitting here, we have now taken live on, it's first on my blog at the Washington Note, but it will soon be everywhere in the blogosphere, a letter co-sponsored by the National Security Network and the New America Foundation to President Obama from a well-known colonel sitting to my right, but also General Claudia Kennedy, General James Hill, Lieutenant General Robert Gard, Lieutenant General Christman, Brigadier General John Adams, Lieutenant General John Castellaw, Major General Paul Eaton, Rear Admiral Donald Guter, Rear Admiral John Hudson, General Barry McCaffrey, and General Johnny Wilson. We'll have copies of this letter for any of you who would like to have it, particularly those in the amendment. It is a letter basically encouraging President Obama to move further and forward on the issue of travel so that the kinds of other issues that David Rothkopf and many of our other panelists just mentioned can be seen to much more vigorously than they are. So this letter is now live, and we're pleased to be able to report it today. I'd also say a while back, this organization, New American Foundation, helped commission a book with Zbigniew Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft and David Ignatius called America and the World, Conversations on the Future of U.S. Foreign Policy. And in the middle of these taped conversations, I asked General Scowcroft what he thought about US-Cuba policy. And General Scowcroft responded something along the lines, the exact words are available, but he said, the US-Cuba policy makes no sense at all as foreign policy. And as far as the embargo goes, we know it can't work because when the Soviet Union stopped patronizing the Cuban economy, we saw it shrink, and we saw that Cuba couldn't be starved to death. I know those are harsh words, but they're true. So it makes no sense as foreign policy. It is domestic policy. And I want to pose a question to the panel, not to respond to now, but I want to open the floor. Did the President's moves yesterday begin to move Cuba out of the domestic policy box and into the foreign policy box? Or are we still very much in the domestic policy box? I would say that we are, but others say that there's now a tilting point strategy or a slippery slope strategy. I'd be interested in your insights. And secondly, again, not to respond to yet, but I do think it's very important for those who have been proponents of the embargo and others, the rationale, which I understand, deals mostly with human rights. And so I'm interested in the question of how human rights should be part of this picture, this lens, and be balanced with other issues, and why, given what David and others have outlined, Bill Reinsch, has the United States allowed itself to use a faulty tool to try to achieve human rights there. But I'm not going to ask any of you to respond now. But let me take questions from the floor. And I should also mention Carl Meacham and Tom Omestad may have to depart a bit early, so I'm going to give them the privilege of responding first to questions because they've got some schedule challenges. Let me go to Peter Kornblue.
Peter Kornblue, National Security Archive. I want to commend everybody for an extraordinary panel at an extraordinary and important, relevant time. I want to address my question to Dr. Sweig about the collective weight of Latin American countries that will be brought on the issue of Cuba this weekend, pointing out that it's not really Hugo Chavez is going to lead this, although he might be loudest, but really three countries, Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil, who have decided to coordinate this campaign on Cuba and bring it first and foremost directly to the desk of face-to-face with Barack Obama. And I'm just wondering what Latin America actually brings. What tools do they have in the kind of a reversal of roles after all these years to pressure the United States on this policy?
I'm going to ask for a quick response from Julia, and I'm going to give Carl Meacham an opportunity to respond too, because I want to make sure Carl's in the mix. Julia?
Thank you. Well, the tools of the public and private campaign of diplomacy, somebody yesterday at the White House briefing called it pressure. This is obviously something that they have made clear is a priority. But I think behind your question is a more difficult one, which is what for the Obama administration is the downside of not going as far as Latin America is asking it to go. And on that fact, the bilateral relationship between the United States and Mexico is clear, and the priorities are evident. The president is going to Mexico now. I can't imagine that the failure on the Cuba front is going to get in the way of that bilateral relationship. Same with Brazil, same with Argentina. So this is a atmospheric, this is a historic moment. This is something that the moral weight of these democratically elected governments can weigh in and continue to push, but up to a point, and I think the White House is clear where that line is, as are the Latin Americans.
Thank you, Julie. Carl?
Well, I would say that particularly coming from Mexico and Brazil, the two countries that the administration, the president has shown most interest in the last 3 months. It's important. I would say that these are going to be the two countries that we're going to want to work with the most. We have threats on the border with Mexico, and we have interests in issues like climate change, renewables with Brazil. And Brazil plays a very important role with regards to influence in South America. So yes, we would be listening to them because of perception at the least. But if the president is going to be true to his word with regards to the change agenda, it's going to be in his interest to make a gesture consistent with what they're asking for. And I think what they're doing, more importantly, is giving him space to maneuver with regards to this difficult issue. So as far as a tool, I think they're giving him opportunities to do more with regards to Cuba.
Carl, before I go to Robert Schlesinger, just very quickly, Senator Lugar, during Hillary Clinton's confirmation hearing, submitted written questions in which he asked various things, and the State Department responded in many of these questions that a major strategic review of U.S.-Cuba policy would be enacted and would be undertaken. My understanding is that the administration is sending mixed signals about whether that strategic review is in fact taking place. Some of my colleagues in Treasury saying it might be, some of my colleagues in the State Department saying not much action. Is Senator Lugar satisfied enough with what came out yesterday to let the issue of strategic review go, or can we expect some follow-up from Senator Lugar?
Well, I would say that we're still in the same place with regards to our interest to see a comprehensive review of the policies. A lot of what happened yesterday was important with regards to our domestic sources of foreign policy making. But once again, as the Senator has said in the letter of transmittal to the report and the letter that was sent to President Obama with regards to the summit, we want to see this, and I think you correctly mentioned, we want to see this conversation go from this domestic approach to the context of foreign policy and foreign relations within the region. And we are yet to hear from the State Department with regards to how we would approach that within the context of foreign policy.
Thank you. Robert?
Robert Schlesinger, U.S. News and World Report. Most of this panel is focused on Cuba policy as foreign policy. And as Steve pointed out, it is domestically driven. And I wonder what everyone thinks of that side of the ledger. Are things changing in terms of domestic politics vis-a-vis Cuban policy, or is it still locked in rigidly?
Julia? And then Bill?
Well, Cuban-American opinion has changed dramatically. We now have 60–70% of Cuban-American opinion supporting not only free travel for Cuban families, but for all Americans. So that's ahead of the curve of where the White House is. The president won the state of Florida for the first time, well, with 35% of the Cuban-American vote, but that was not the vote that got him over the line in the state of Florida. The traditional hardline Cuban-American voters voted for McCain. He won with non-Cuban Hispanic votes. He won with African-American votes. He won with independents, with disgruntled Republicans. But the Cuban-Americans have been advocating, as we know, for much broader policies than just travel. However, the White House, in my view, seems to have its eye on the next presidential election and on the midterms, but especially the next presidential election. This political allergy toward stepping on that third rail is very, very strong, and it seems to me that it still does, from what I heard yesterday and from the language of yesterday's announcements, lean toward the domestic politics more than toward the foreign policy still.
What I think is very important, Robert, before I go to Bill Reinsch, is to go look at some of the executives who have served at the Cuban-American National Foundation. One, the CANF report is a remarkable report that has itself moved dramatically on many of the issues. Secondly, the former general counsel, the former executive director of CANF, are advocates of incredible liberalization, particularly during the period of tight strangling of the U.S.-Cuba restrictions during the last term of the Bush administration. So there are numerous CANF, Cuban-American National Foundation spokesmen that can be drawn on to give a sense of the generational change down there. But Bill Reinsch?
Well, I agree with Julia. I think, first of all, the fact that the policy was articulated yesterday in terms of democracy and human rights demonstrates exactly what she said, that there's still a perceived need to explain these things in terms that resonate with the Cuban-American community domestically. At the same time, we see that the community, or at least that part of the community that cares strongly on the other side of this issue, is declining, and it's been in decline for the last 10 or 15 years. The Cuban vote as a percentage of the Latino vote in Florida is declining and continues to decline. Probably more importantly, the polling data from that part of the country suggests a continuing generational split. The people that feel the strongest and the most negative about opening to Cuba are the older generation. Their children and their grandchildren don't feel that way. If anything, they want to go back and visit their grandmother, or go to a funeral, or not they don't want to go to a funeral, but they feel they need to go to a funeral or go to a wedding. They want to restore ties. They don't view it in the same way that the generation that lost their property there and emigrated in the 60s views it. That generation is declining in numbers for obvious reasons, and as the younger generation takes over, I think that point of view will continue to erode.
Carl wanted to make a quick comment.
Just very quickly, I mean, we fail to remember sometimes that all politics is local, period, in this country. With regards to foreign policy, that goes as well. And I would just remind you that we have seen a change in the environment with regards to Cuba in the Congress. We've had more than 20 co-sponsors for the travel bill, which is a positive development. We've had over 120 in the House for the same travel bill. We also had more than 15 senators wanting the Treasury Department to actually implement the provisions of the omnibus on cash in advance in a way that was advantageous to them and not a strict or a narrow interpretation, as one senator, Democratic senator, wanted it to be. So, yes, there is a change in environment in the Congress, but we have a ways to go still.
Larry?
There's another dimension to this, too, and unfortunately it goes all the way back to the '68 convention for the Democrats. And when I talk to some of my more Sam Nunn-like Democrat friends, this dimension becomes very, very vibrant and resonant. President Obama can only show ankle on national security in so many places. He's showing it with regard to Iran. He's showing it with regard to Iraq. He's a little wishy-washy on North Korea, but I suspect it's going to come out that way with North Korea. These are far more formidable threats, if you will, than Cuba. Cuba represents no threat at all. And again, is low-hanging fruit for him to be strong on national security and not to seem to be weak. So we have to play it in this whole panoply of national security interest and political situation the Democrats sometimes find themselves in.
Let me go to Wayne Smith, who's our former director of our America Interest section in Cuba, our ambassador equivalent, essentially. So, Wayne Smith.
Thanks. Yesterday's announcement could only have been a disappointment. I don't know how anyone can say it was an important step forward. The word had gone out last week that the administration was indeed going to lift travel controls on academics, cultural groups, and so forth. And even as of yesterday morning, there were statements to that effect from official sources. And yet, by the afternoon, when we had that very disappointing press conference with a very disappointing statement, it was all over. Now it's just Cuban Americans. And the suggestion of a dialogue was phrased in such terms I can't imagine the Cubans will accept it. My question, I put it to Larry, but anyone can answer, what happened to bring this about? What happened to bring it from what could have been a very constructive, a very positive step in the right direction to this real disappointment?
Colonel Wilkerson.
I can only refer you to my immediately previous answer and to the domestic considerations that were pointed out up here, too. It's David, I associate myself 100% with David's remarks. This is just, it's idiocy. George Shultz said to Charlie Rose in 2004, our Cuba sanctions are ridiculous. But it's a place that really doesn't grab your attention. And if you've got to gain something politically, domestically, then you gain it vis-a-vis Cuba.
Let me just quickly, Wayne, I can't. I'm sorry. Let me just give one counterpoint. Someone close to the president shared with me that this was an opening move, that anyone would be silly to think that the president's opening move, when you have to both create an architecture with Congress in which you've inherited a mess, essentially, and you've got as Tom Omestad, I think, very adroitly pointed out, lots of questions in terms of the response on the Cuban side. So you've got that. That when I think of who's in the room, I think there are probably three people: David Axelrod, Rahm Emanuel, and Dennis McDonough. And Dennis is a very, very smart strategist who probably agreed to what looks like pandering to South Florida communities as and I'm this is all speculation on my part about what Dennis did, but agrees that this would be a way to sort of create a tilting point strategy, if you will, both with opening up lots of travel, and I actually think the telecom stuff, which no one's talked much about, Tom did, is remarkably important, because what no one's looked at is 6 months ago, Raul Castro provided a similar kind of electronic systems, DVD, video, and cell phone liberalization that got poo-pooed here. I found it interesting that that was in the package. So I would just point that if you look at it as an opening move strategy and something which you've got travel bills, which Rahm Emanuel would have had to give the wink and nod to Congressman Delahunt to proceed, that there is not entirely a negative story here. But Tom Omestad and then David.
Well, thanks, Steve. This has to be my final comment because, unfortunately, I need to run. But I think that there's a significant risk here that policy could get stuck in the same old rut. That is to say, we're waiting for a reaction from Cuba. We de facto yoke U.S. policy moves to responses from Cuba. And because of the obviously mixed feelings about really plying the waters of a full détente with Washington in Havana, there's a significant risk that things will get stuck again. Same old rut with new parameters. I call this Cuba policy is sort of the Energizer bunny of U.S. foreign policy. It just keeps on ticking, and I'm afraid that this policy is going to, in effect, keep on ticking for a good while longer.
Oh, not when we're done with it. But David Rothkopf?
I would suggest, by the way, that one other person in that room is likely Greg Craig.
Yes.
Who was the lawyer for Elian Gonzalez and has been deeply involved.
Greg Craig is the White House counsel.
Right, and who's been deeply involved in this issue for a long time. I think that the Obama administration has been generally cautious on almost every issue. I don't think that there have been a lot of bold strokes. I think most things have sort of fit within a kind of a zone of expectations, and I don't think this is inconsistent in that regard. But I do think in the context of the earlier question about politics and in terms of this question, that what's really called for here is a kind of a cultural revolution in the culture of discussions about this, and that a lot of the people who are cowed by the politics of Florida and the loud microphones that are used by some of the people in the traditional anti-Castro community in Florida are the policy community, who respond to this as though, this were the same issue it has been for the past 50 years. And nothing captures that quite so well for me as Steve's earlier reference to the need for a major strategic review of Cuba, which is not major or strategic. If you couch everything in the language of, serious debate about serious issues, people will continue to treat it that way. This is not a serious issue. There is no serious debate about the merits of the policy. There should be no serious debate about the change that is required. And we should not be comfortable with continuing on autopilot as we have been for 50 years on the issue.
Julia, quick.
I want to get to Wayne's question, because I actually think that to say that this is domestic politics and you can't look weak, we've heard that many, many times before. By way of history, in 1998 and 1999, just 1 and 2 years after the shoot down of the two Cessnas by the Cuban Air Force, the Clinton administration, as the Pope was preparing to visit to Cuba, announced a series of 13 categories of legal travel for Americans, all Americans, not just Cuban Americans. And that was the educational, religious, cultural, scientific, you name it, sorts of exchanges. And that process began to actually connect Americans and Cubans, society to society. He did that just after the Cubans had shot down 2 planes and killed 3 of the 4 passengers. That was way before the Cuban-American community was anywhere near where it is in terms of its attitudes towards change towards Cuba. It was way before the world and Latin America were where it was. So the fact that what we got yesterday was only the Cuban-American announcements, when they have the legal authority to go much broader with the people-to-people travel that already exists, the capacity to do it legally, is inexplicable to me, and it can only be explained by this sort of United States of amnesia quality that American policy thinkers tend to have. That was a reference to Gore Vidal, who talked about the United States as the United States of amnesia, with no historical sense of what their own government did basically 3 seconds ago. So,
Mike, did you want to comment?
Well, I think, look, I tend to agree with Colonel Wilkerson. Here we have a president of the party that has been attacked as being soft on defense, and recently on spreading democracy, according to the Bush administration, has promised to close Guantanamo, get our troops out of Iraq, abandon the use of torture. Has just declared we want to abolish nuclear weapons as an ultimate goal of foreign policy. Only Nixon could go to China. Is not a synonym for only McGovern could go to China. And I think that's what's haunting this Democratic president, who's the only Democratic president, apart from 2 others, in this period since the Vietnam War, when the Democrats were identified as the more dovish of the parties. So, I granted it makes no sense in real life terms, but as Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, the United States is governed not by logic but by Congress. And I do think that there's a point at which this president is going to expose himself to really blistering attacks from the right as a result of a series of what we may all agree are quite intelligent and long overdue actions. But that's got to be a political
Might get blistering attacks from the middle. Let me go to John McAuliffe and then Gary, but I'm going to encourage both of you to be brief because we're running out of time here.
John McAuliffe from the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. The question that gets left out, though, is the rest of American public opinion. I mean, every poll, including CNN, suggests that 2/3 of Americans want to end travel restrictions, want to normalize relations, and why isn't that a plus for Obama to lead on? I want to ask you all a question very specifically. Obama in Europe, in Turkey, gave these, and in his video address on Saturday, which I quote on the blue sheet, gave this incredibly high-minded position of dialogue with the Muslim world, of mutual respect with Iran. I mean, can't we reasonably expect that he would go to the Trinidad and Tobago and apply the same kind of rhetoric to our own neighborhood?
Thanks, John. Brief responses? Bill?
It's not that important, as David said. So,
Bill?
Sorry.
I would just, I take the point. I would just say on polling issues, the kind of things you're citing don't reflect intensity. Sure, that's what the American people think. Then if you ask them, what are the 20 biggest problems that the country faces, they'll echo what David said. This is number 84. There's pockets of people in South Florida and apparently New Jersey for whom this is number 1. And they feel very, very strongly about it. And to the extent that their representatives can play decisive roles in the Congress, which was certainly true when the Republicans controlled Congress previously, and appears to be at least in part true now, then it makes they have a weight that's disproportionate to their total numbers. And I think that is why that there's going to be some caution continuously reflected in the administration. That's not. It's politically rational. It's not good policy.
I'm going to offer just a counterpoint on the whether it's important or not. Maybe David Rothkopf and I can have a blog struggle about this. There is another dimension to this, and my friend Sarah Stevens gets upset when I mention it, but I'm going to anyway. But for those folks who follow the Middle East and look at Iran's activities in the region, transnational meddling inside other countries, and its use of proxies to represent itself, one of which is, most importantly, Syria. I see similarities in Venezuela today to Iran, to some degree in the region, less significant, but still some of the same behaviors, transnational meddling in the region, and a proxy in which we've clearly seen Hugo Chavez attempt to at least position himself as inheritor of the Castro mantle, if you will. And from my experiences in talking to Cubans in Cuba, there is a lot of irritation about the bravado and the profile of Hugo Chavez as this sort of dominant patron inside Cuba. And whether that is spread throughout Cuba or not, but to neglect the importance of putting Cuba, allowing Cuba to diversify itself in the region, and to look that automatically creates some distance, which I would say is healthy, between Cuba and the Venezuela portfolios, is a different way to look at the geostrategic game inside that region that takes it out of the box that I think David put it in. I happen to see, and you'll not be surprised, that I'm also an advocate of giving Syria opportunities to diversify its portfolio should it want to. That creates net benefits from a geostrategic perspective for the United States. So we can quibble about that, but I did want to say there are different ways to look at this Cuba prism than just within the realm of the bilateral relationship or even the broader relationship. But David?
Well, just to give a hint of the Titanic blog struggle that will follow, that I'm sure everybody will be tuned into. I think Iran is an interesting illustration. Another case, of course, here is a country that is the largest state sponsor of terror, that is avowed to seek the destruction of, our primary ally in the region and us, and whose nuclear program violates the core laws that protect us from proliferation in the world, and is almost undoubtedly going to trigger a massive nuclear arms race across the region. And
I recognize there are differences, some subtle differences.
There's some subtle differences, and yet our approach to Iran is to soften up, right, to engage, and that's a serious issue. I do think, by the way, though, that you're right to direct the attention to the other larger irritants in the hemisphere, and I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I suspect that it will be less than a year or two before you are back here having a session discussing what the United States does about the nuclear program in Venezuela.
It's interesting.
And I would say that is, given what we're doing with Iran, what we've done with North Korea, what we've done with Pakistan, it is a dead certainty. And our focus will quickly get off of this, this sort of distant memory of an issue and move on to some things that are a little bit more compelling from a strategic point of view.
Thank you, David. Let me quickly go to Gary and this gentleman right here, but I've got to make it very brief because...
Quickly, what I'm going to do is pose a question that asks
You're going to ask
anybody
it right
on the
now,
panel,
because I'm going to...
Anybody on the panel to finish the sentence, and it stems from David Rothkopf's making what seems to me the obvious point about if you look at $1.5 billion and 20,000 jobs, you're in the rounding era realm.
Okay.
The question that I want to be sure I leave here today with is how to finish the sentence. A major shift in U.S. policy toward Cuba serves the American national interest by?
Well,
focusing on real priorities?
Yeah. Julia?
Eliminating a failed policy that's an enormous irritant, disproportionate to its actual significance in the hemisphere.
Yeah. Right. We'll go right here, and then Mark.
A brief question to the panel. What's the chances for a full Monty on the whole thing instead of this slow extraction out of a quite embarrassing policy?
Well, since it happened yesterday, low.
Low.
Well, in my view, you didn't see a full Monty yesterday, so that was their first move. So it's a easy. Anyone disagree with me? Okay, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. I participated in a global seminar in Salzburg a few months before Obama was elected, and there was a lot of talk about Cuba. And the feeling there, very strong feeling, was that this was low-hanging fruit, and it would be highly symbolic for Obama to make all sorts of policy changes with regard to Cuba. I'm wondering what this action does for global perception about Obama's promise for change we can believe in.
That's
because we talk about change that we can believe in with the idea that we'll believe that he can bring change, but there's also the idea that this is the kind of change we can believe in, which is not much change at all.
So global perception of this move. Let me ask each of you to quickly respond. Larry Wilkerson?
Not much.
Okay, Michael Lind?
Well, apart from the Latin Americans, I don't think this is a major issue, for the Europeans or the Asians or people in the rest of the world. And Obama's been so bold comparatively on other fronts. I think that they'll forgive him for timidity on this front.
I agree with that.
Julia?
I agree with Michael.
Obama's still on his first date with the planet Earth, and so it's all anticipation.
I just,
Bill?
I think they'll be. It's a small positive step. They'll be happy and call it a small positive step and say, you know, we want more. And I think we should be cautious about making judgments on what is, to me, clearly an interim step. Come back in a few months and have another discussion and see what else has happened.
I think it's the first move in a long dance in U.S.-Cuba relationships, which unfortunately will go on beyond its weight or what it should be, but it will go on. And I sort of see the administration somewhat expecting a lawsuit on the travel provisions and probably wanting that. I probably see more Republican congressmen in the Midwest joining these travel bills because of the interest of moving agricultural trade and others forward. And I think that you know, what's happened when you have sort of what I call punctuation points, people don't like it, but when you see marks, demarcations in history, and I think we're at one here in the United States, and I think we're at one in Cuba, we're at one in other places of the world, I think it's important to give an opportunity for that pivot to happen rather than miss the currents of history. And hopefully we'll move that way and move to something that makes more sense for the country. Let me, before I thank the panel, encourage all of you to buy Cuba, What Everyone Needs to Know by Julia Sweig. Make sure you pick up 9 Ways for the United States to talk to Cuba and for Cuba to talk to the United States. If you haven't read David Rothkopf's book, Running the World, The Inside Story of the National Security Council and the Architects of American Power, and to see Colonel Wilkerson's co-signed letter with many other generals on U.S.-Cuba policy, and go check out the NFTC website, and by the way, read Michael Lynn's American Way of Strategy. I want to thank everyone here and thank all of you for joining us for this morning's forum.